The wolf was dying in the snow when she found him, and she gave him the only warmth she had. Aylesworth had been walking since the light went grey, since the road stopped being a road and became a suggestion under the drifts, since the last waymarker she recognized had vanished behind her into the white. The blizzard had come down off the northern ridge without warning, the way winter storms did in this country, turning an ordinary afternoon into something that wanted to kill her. She had her mother's chest strapped to her back, her boots soaked through past feeling, and nothing else in the world. She saw the shape first as a boulder, dark against the snow. Then it moved, and she understood it was an animal, and then she got close enough to understand. It was not any animal she had a name for. A wolf, but wrong in scale, its shoulder alone higher than her waist, its side rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Blood had frozen dark in the fur along one flank. One of its great paws was bent at an angle no paw should bend at. She should have walked past it. Every practical instinct she owned told her to walk past it, because a wounded animal that size could take her arm off before it died, and because she had nothing to spare, not warmth, not time, not the strength to help anything larger than herself. She knelt down anyway. "You're not going to make it through the night like this," she said, to the wolf, to the snow, to no one who could answer her. Her voice sounded strange to her, thinned out by the wind. She unclasped her cloak with fingers that had stopped being reliable an hour ago and laid it over the animal's ribs, tucking it as best she could around the wound. It was wool, mended twice at the hem, the only warm thing she owned, and she gave it away without deciding to, the way you give away things when the alternative is watching something die in front of you and doing nothing. The wolf's eye opened. Dark, and far too aware for an animal in this much pain, it looked at her for a long moment and did not growl and did not pull away. "There's a hut," she said. "I passed a shepherd's hut not far back. If you can stand, I can get you that far. I can't carry you. I can barely carry myself." She did not know why she was speaking to it, as though it understood her. She did not know why, when it struggled up onto 3 legs, favoring the 4th, she put her shoulder under its flank and let it lean its considerable weight into her, or why she kept talking the whole stumbling way back to the hut, telling it about nothing, about the village she'd left behind, about her mother, about the cold, just to have a sound between them that was not only the wind. The hut was one room, half its roof caved in, but the half that remained kept the worst of the storm out. She built what fire she could from a broken stool and the frame of an old grain bin, and she sat through the night with the wolf's head heavy in her lap, her cloak over its ruined side, her own coat gone to it hours before when the cloak alone had not been enough. She did not sleep. She watched the fire burn down to nothing and watched the animals breathing even out, slow and steady, somewhere near dawn. When the grey light came through the broken roof, the wolf was gone. She woke with a start, reaching for a weight that was no longer in her lap, and found only her cloak, neatly, impossibly, for an animal with no hands, folded beside her, and a strange stillness in the room where something enormous had been. She told herself later she must have dreamed the folding. She never quite believed herself. She was on her feet again within the hour, because standing still in that hut would have finished what the blizzard started. She walked the rest of that day on rumour and instinct, following a track other travellers had told her about days before, toward a great house that took in strangers during the deep winter months. Frostmere Hold, they called it, the seat of the Alpha King. She did not know, when she said the name to herself for warmth, the way you say any distant, powerful thing to make the cold feel smaller, that she had spent the night before with her cloak over his ribs, and her voice in his ear the whole time he could not find the strength to change back. Part 2. Frostmere. Hold rose out of the white like something that had always been there and always would be. Grey stone and iron dark timber, smoke standing straight up from a dozen chimneys into a sky that had finally gone calm. Aylesworth stood at the gate longer than she meant to, aware of how she must look, hollow-eyed, cloakless in all but name, carrying a dead woman's chest on her back like it was the only argument she had for being let inside. It was a woman near her own age who found her there, arms full of linens, who took one look and did not ask questions before pulling her through the gate. "You'll freeze to death admiring the architecture," the woman said. "Kitchen's this way. I'm Tamsin. Don't tell the steward you walked the North Road alone. He'll have opinions." The steward had opinions anyway, mostly about the number of mouths already at his table for the winter. But Frostmere Hold ran on an old custom Aylesworth hadn't fully believed until she saw it in practice. No traveller was turned away from the gates between the first snow and the thaw, whatever else the house's politics demanded. She was given a pallet in the servants' wing, work in the laundry court, and after the first week, something she had not expected to find anywhere again after the flood took her village, a kind of quiet. She did not see the Alpha King. She heard about him, the way everyone below stairs heard about the person the whole house orbited, that he'd been thrown from his horse on a hunting circuit during the blizzard, that he'd come back 3 days late and said little about it, that something in him had been strange since. The kennel master complained that the hounds wouldn't settle at dawn anymore, kept pacing toward the north gate, like they were waiting on someone. Nobody below stairs connected that to the new laundry girl. Why would they? The cloak dried, eventually, and she wore it again, mended a third time at the hem where the ice had worn through. She thought, sometimes, of the wolf in the hut, the weight of its head, the strange steadiness of that dark eye watching her through the worst of the pain. She hoped, in the unfocused way you hope for things you'll never confirm, that it had made it wherever it needed to go. It was 3 weeks into her time at the Hold when the Alpha King found the cloak before he found her. Part 3. Draymere had not told anyone what happened on the ridge, not his physician, who assumed the injuries were from the fall, not his steward, who assumed the distraction was pain, not even Roderick, his second closest thing he had to a brother, who had ridden the search party out 3 days too late because Draymere had been unable to explain, in any words that wouldn't sound like madness, that his wolf had taken him somewhere none of them would think to look, and that a stranger with a thin voice and a cloak too worn for the weather had kept him alive through the worst of it with nothing but her own warmth, and a story about a flooded village that he'd listened to with his eyes half closed, drifting in and out of a pain that should have killed him. He remembered almost none of it as a man. He remembered all of it as the wolf, which was its own particular torment, because the wolf did not experience things the way he did, and translating fur memory into anything useful was like trying to recall a dream days after waking. He knew there had been a girl. He knew there had been a hut, a fire, a voice. He knew, with a certainty, that unsettled him more than the injury had, that some part of him had chosen to stop fighting for its life in that hut, and had trusted a stranger to keep it going instead, and that his wolf had not made a decision like that in 11 years of ruling this hold. He found the cloak because Tamsin, gathering laundry for mending, left the basket in the wrong hall, and he was walking past it, thinking about nothing in particular, when something in the weave stopped him. He crouched by the basket, like a man 20 years younger than his station, and lifted it out, and there it was. Wool, twice mended at the hem, now 3 times. A smell under the lye soap that his wolf recognized before his mind caught up, faint, half-buried, but unmistakably the same. He stood there long enough that a passing maid asked if he required anything, and he said no, and kept the cloak, and asked in a voice he worked hard to keep level whose it was. He found her in the still room 2 days later, an excuse half-formed about an inventory he didn't need checked. She was measuring dried herbs into small paper twists, unaware of him in the doorway for a full 10 seconds, which gave him time to notice things he had no business noticing. The particular economy of her movements, like someone who had learned to do everything with the least possible waste of effort. A scar along one knuckle that she favoured without seeming to know she did it. The way she hummed, almost inaudibly, some tune that had no obvious source. "You mended this," he said, and set the cloak on the table in front of her. She looked up, and he watched her place him, not by rank, not immediately, just as a man in the doorway, before the weight of who he was arrived a half-second later, and she straightened, wary. "It's mine," she said. "I can pay for the laundering if it was mixed up with something of the house's. That isn't what I asked." He kept his voice even. "You mended this yourself, twice before this basket. I want to know where you were 3 weeks ago, on the night the North Road was closed by the storm." Something moved across her face, quick and guarded. "Why?" "Because I think you saved my life, and I have spent 3 weeks unable to prove it to a single person in this house, including myself." The silence that followed had a shape to it, dense and strange, neither of them quite willing to be the one to break it first. It was Aylesworth who spoke. "There was a wolf," she said slowly. "Enormous. Hurt badly. I gave it my cloak and got it to a hut and sat with it till dawn. It was gone when I woke." She studied him, and something in her expression sharpened, disbelieving and not disbelieving at once. "That isn't possible." "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't be." He did not explain further, because there was no way to explain further that wouldn't require a conversation neither of them was ready to have in a still room with the door open. He asked her instead how long she had been at the hold, and she said 3 weeks, and he said he had not realized it had only been 3 weeks, because something about the timing felt older than that, and she said most people found the winter made time strange, and there was nothing to say after that. So he left. He came back the next morning, on no excuse at all. Part 4. It became, without either of them naming it as such, a pattern. He found reasons to walk past the still room. She found herself listening for a particular tread in the corridor, distinct from the steward's, from Roderick's, from anyone else's. Neither of them discussed the wolf again directly, though it sat between every exchange, an understanding too large to voice and too strange to leave unacknowledged. The roster changed without comment 3 days after their first conversation. Aylesworth found herself reassigned from the outdoor laundry court, where the mornings were bitter, and the walk back after dark cut across the exposed north yard to the still room proper, a warmer post with better hours. The steward told her it was an administrative correction, staffing balanced more sensibly for the season. He did not know, and did not ask, why the Alpha King had personally reviewed the laundry roster that week for the first time in his memory. Tamsin noticed. Tamsin noticed most things. "He's never once looked at a duty roster," she said, folding linens with the particular energy of someone delivering gossip she considered important. "Not in 4 years I've worked here. And now yours changes, and it's better hours, and it's warmer, and you want me to believe that's an accident of administration." "It's an accident of administration," Aylesworth said, and did not believe herself either. It was easier, in the still room, to notice things about him she hadn't had the leisure to notice in the corridor. He came by more often than any inventory required. He asked questions that didn't need her rank's permission to ask, and then waited, patiently, for real answers, rather than the deference most people offered him by reflex. He had a way of going very still when something troubled him that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a man managing more than any one person should have to manage alone. She saw him properly, for the first time, on an evening she wasn't meant to see him at all. She had been sent with a message for Roderick, and found the council chamber empty, but for the Alpha King, alone at the long table after the lords had gone. A single candle burned low beside him. He held a page in his hand. The same page, she realized, after a moment of watching from the doorway he didn't know she occupied, that he had been holding when she'd glimpsed the meeting break up an hour before. He had not turned it once. His eyes moved over the same lines again and again, without reading them. The posture of a man too tired to know he'd stopped working, and too responsible to admit it, and go to bed. She did not go in. She did not clear her throat, or offer to bring him anything, or do any of the things a servant might reasonably do in that moment. She simply stood there for the length of one held breath, understanding something about him that she hadn't let herself understand before, that the person holding this entire house up was also quietly, privately, running out of the strength it took to do it. And then she turned and carried the understanding away with her, unspoken, into the rest of her evening. It was 2 days after that, when the ice took the north stairwell. She had been crossing the exposed landing with an armful of drying cloths, when the stone gave way beneath a patch of black ice she hadn't seen, her feet going out from under her toward the open stair edge and the long drop to the courtyard below. She did not fully register what happened next except as a blur of motion, and then his arm, solid and certain, closing around her waist and hauling her back against him before her mind had finished understanding she was falling. For a moment, neither of them moved, his chest against her back, his arm still locked around her, both of them breathing harder than the few seconds of danger should have warranted. He did not say anything, and did not look down at her, and she did not look up at him, and when the moment passed, he released her without comment, stepping back to a careful, correct distance, and asked if she was hurt. "No," she said. "Thank you. Watch the north landing. The ice comes up through the stone before it shows on top." "I will." He left. She told herself, walking the rest of the way to the laundry, with her pulse still unsteady, that it was the fall that had unsettled her, and not the arm that had stopped it. She did not entirely believe that either. Tamsin found her 20 minutes later, still faintly rattled, wringing out a cloth that did not need wringing. "You've gone somewhere else," Tamsin said, watching her with open curiosity. "What happened?" "I nearly fell on the north landing." And nothing. He caught me. He told me to watch the ice." "Aylesworth." Tamsin set down her basket entirely, giving the conversation the full weight of her attention. "Do you understand what you're describing to me? The Alpha King of this entire hold, a man who has council seats fighting for the privilege of his notice, personally hauled you back from a 2-story fall, and then stood there long enough to lecture you about ice. It isn't like that. It's exactly like that. I've worked in this house 4 years. I have watched him walk past servants half frozen in worse weather than that landing without breaking stride, because that is what a man in his position is trained to do, and I have never once seen him break stride for anyone the way he's been breaking it for you since the week the roster changed." Tamsin picked the basket back up, not unkindly, but with the particular bluntness of someone who liked her too much to let her keep pretending. "I'm not telling you to do anything about it. I'm telling you to stop acting surprised every time it happens." Aylesworth did not have an answer for that, and did not try to invent one, and carried the conversation with her for the rest of the week, the way she'd carried the memory of the still-room doorway, turning it over in odd, quiet moments, unable to make it smaller than it was. Part 5. Lady Isoline Vantress had built her position at Frostmere over 11 careful years, and she had not built it by missing things. She noticed the roster change before most of the house did. She noticed the Alpha King's altered pattern of movement through the east corridor, a route that had never previously intersected with the still room, and now did, twice most days. She noticed, with the particular cold clarity of someone whose entire security depended on reading a room correctly, that something in the balance of the household had shifted since the winter storm, and that the shift traced back to a laundry girl with no name anyone important could immediately place. She did not confront it directly. That was not her method. Isoline's power at Frostmere had never come from volume or cruelty. It came from her seat on the council, her careful alliances among the lords who managed the hold's northern borders, and her long-cultivated reputation as the most reasonable, most competent voice in any room she occupied. She had spent 11 years making herself the person the Alpha King relied on for continuity, for institutional memory, for the quiet management of a household, that could not run on instinct alone. A laundry girl was not a threat to any of that, not directly, but an unexplained shift in the Alpha King's attention was a threat to the marriage alliance she had spent the better part of a year quietly assembling with the northern house of Kale, a match that would secure the border, secure the council's confidence, and secure, not incidentally, her own position for another decade. She raised the matter with the council in careful procedural language, framing it not as jealousy, but as concern, a serving girl of unknown origin, unusually favored, unusually positioned near the Alpha King's private movements. Was anyone certain of her background? Had anyone verified her claims about the flood, the village, the family she said she'd lost? In times as delicate as these, with the Northern Alliance so close to completion, was it wise to leave such a question unexamined? It was not an accusation. It was never an accusation. It was a question, asked in the mildest possible tone, that nonetheless produced exactly the result Isoline intended. A formal review of Aylesworth's presence at the hold, quietly scheduled, quietly framed as routine, with a recommendation already drafted for her reassignment to a household 3 days' ride south before the matter could complicate anything further. Old Sedwin, the hold's archivist, watched the whole maneuver unfold from his usual corner of the council chamber and understood it for exactly what it was before anyone else did. He found Aylesworth in the still room that evening, an old man who had long since stopped pretending to care about rank, and told her plainly what the kennel master had confided to him that morning, that every wolf in the kennels, without exception, had begun lowering its head when she crossed the yard, not growling, not fleeing, lowering its head one after another over the course of a week, starting with the lowest ranked and youngest animals and moving steadily upward through the pack's hierarchy. "There's an old belief in this house," Sedwin said, settling into the chair across from her, with the careful slowness of a man whose joints had opinions about the cold. "Older than any council seat, older than Isoline Vantress's family name, that an Alpha King's wolf does not answer to blood or to command. It answers to something it recognizes on its own, in its own time, and when it does, the rest of the pack follows, without being told to. It hasn't happened in this house in 4 generations. I did not think I would live to see it happen in this one." "I don't understand what you're telling me." "I'm telling you," Sedwin said, "that whatever is happening to you is not going to be explained by a council review, and that Lady Vantress knows that better than anyone, which is exactly why she's trying to have you gone before the pack makes it impossible to pretend otherwise." Part 6. The order came 3 days later, delivered with scrupulous courtesy. A reassignment to a household in the Southern Valley, a generous severance, a caravan departing at first light, all of it dressed in language so reasonable that objecting to it would have looked like exactly the impropriety Isoline had implied all along. Aylesworth read the paper twice in the lamplight of her narrow room, and understood, with a calm that surprised her, that she had no standing to refuse it. She was a servant. Servants were reassigned. That was the whole of her leverage in this house, and it was none at all. She was folding what little she owned into her mother's chest when Draymir found her. He did not knock. He simply appeared in the doorway the way he had a habit of doing now, and stopped when he saw what she was doing, and something in his face went very still in the way she had learned. Over these past weeks meant he was working hard not to show what he felt. "You're leaving," he said. "I'm being reassigned." She kept her eyes on the folding, because looking at him felt suddenly like more than she could manage. "There's a caravan at first light. I only heard an hour ago." His voice had an edge to it she hadn't heard before, controlled, but only barely. "This went through the council without my signature." "It doesn't need your signature. I'm a laundry girl. Reassigning a laundry girl doesn't require the Alpha King's attention." Aylesworth. It was the first time he had said her name. She looked up then, because she couldn't not, and found him closer than she'd realized, close enough that the space between them had narrowed to almost nothing without either of them choosing it, close enough that she could see the particular exhaustion in his face that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the last 3 weeks. He looked for a moment, like a man about to say something he had been carrying since a hut on the North Road, something that had waited 3 weeks for a shape it could survive being spoken in. "I have spent every day since the storm," he said quietly, "trying to work out how to tell you what you did for me without sounding like I'd lost my mind. And every day I told myself there would be time, that I could wait until I understood it myself before I said anything to you. I don't have that time anymore, apparently. So I'm going to say it badly instead of not at all. I don't want you reassigned. I don't want you 3 days south. I want—" A bell rang out across the yard below, sharp and urgent. The frost bell. The kennel master used only for genuine emergencies, and whatever he had been about to say died in his throat as both of them turned toward the window, toward the sound of raised voices in the courtyard, toward whatever was happening that couldn't wait until morning. He looked back at her for one more second, something unfinished and aching in his expression, and then duty took him the way it always did, out the door and down the stairs, before either of them had gotten to say the rest of it. She stood alone in the small room for a long moment afterward, her heart going harder than the interruption alone accounted for, and then she went to find out what the bell meant, because staying still had never once solved anything for her. Roderick caught her on the stairs, moving fast in the opposite direction from the yard, and stopped short at the sight of her. "You should be on that caravan by morning," he said, though there was no real force behind it, more observation than order. "Whatever he was about to say to you up there, half the guard corridor heard the start of it through the door, before the bell went. It's not exactly a secret anymore. It never got finished." "No." Roderick's expression softened, unexpected in a man who carried himself, most days, like a wall built specifically to keep problems away from the Alpha King. "For what it's worth, I've served him 9 years. I have never once seen him lose his composure discussing a duty roster. I put that reassignment order under more scrutiny than I've put anything through in a long while, once I understood what it actually was. Whatever this is, I don't think it's going to fit back inside the shape Lady Vantris built for it." He did not wait for her answer, already moving toward the smoke and shouting below, and she followed a moment later, carrying his words with her the same way she was carrying everything else that strange night had handed her. Part 7. What the bell meant was a fire in the kennel block, started by an overturned lamp, contained quickly, but not before the panic of it had every hound in the yard baying and straining against rope and gate. Draymere was already there when she arrived, moving through the chaos with the particular authority of a man the animals trusted more than they trusted their own fear. And it was in the middle of that noise and smoke and confusion that his control slipped in a way she had never seen it slip before. His wolf came to the surface without his permission, the way it had on the ridge 3 weeks ago, and for a moment the man staggered, hand braced against the kennel wall, caught between two selves fighting for the same body, in the worst possible moment to fight about it. Aylesworth reached him before Roderick did, before anyone else registered what was happening, and did the only thing she had done for this particular struggle once before. She put her hand flat against his chest, over the wild, unsteady beat of his heart, and held it there. "Stay," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it under the noise. "I'm here. You don't have to go anywhere. Stay." He went still under her hand. His forehead came down to rest against hers, unplanned, instinctive, the smoke and the shouting and the whole burning night reduced for one suspended moment to nothing but the point where they touched, his breathing slowing to match some rhythm she was setting, without either of them deciding it consciously. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying in that particular silence. When he straightened again a few seconds later, he was fully himself, and the fire was nearly out, and the hounds had begun to settle. It was in that settling that the rest of it happened, in front of the whole yard, in front of Roderick and the kennel master and half the household staff who had come running at the bell, in front of Lady Iseline Vantris, who had arrived at the edge of the chaos in a fur-lined robe with an expression of polished concern that did not survive what happened next. The hounds, calmed from their fire panic, did not return to their kennels. One by one, starting with the youngest and moving through the pack in an order that mirrored exactly what Sedwin had described days before, they crossed the yard and lay down around Aylesworth's feet, heads lowered, in full view of everyone present. It was not chaos, it was not confusion, it was unmistakably deliberate, an entire pack making a choice together and making certain the whole household watched them make it. The yard went silent, except for the last of the fire settling to embers. It was old Sedwin who spoke into that silence, his old voice carrying further than it had any right to. "I believe," he said, "the council will want to reconsider this morning's reassignment order." Isoline's composure, 11 years in the building, cracked for exactly as long as it took her to remember she was being watched by half the household. And in that crack, Roderick, who had quietly been gathering, over the preceding days, the paperwork trail behind the reassignment order at Draymere's private request, stepped forward and asked her, with careful procedural politeness, whether she could explain why the order bore a council quorum seal from a session that records showed had been convened with only 3 lords present, too short of what the law required. There was no dramatic confession. There was no raised voice. There was only Iseline Vantress, standing in the ash-smelling yard, watching the same institution she had spent 11 years mastering turn with quiet and total correctness against her, and finding, for the first time anyone present could recall, absolutely nothing to say in her own defense. What showed in her eyes, in that long, silent moment, was not defiance. It was fear, plain and unmasked, the fear of a woman who had built her whole life on being indispensable, and had just discovered, in front of everyone, that she was not. The council review that followed in the coming days was procedural, unhurried, and thorough, precisely the kind of process Iseline herself had always claimed to believe in. It concluded with the striking of her council seat, the annulment of the reassignment order, and a formal, if quiet, acknowledgment, recorded in the Hold's own ledgers, that Aylesworth of no recorded house had been recognized, in the old and rarely invoked language of Frostmere's founding charter, by the pack in its entirety, a recognition the charter stated plainly no council vote had the standing to override. Part 8. Spring came to Frostmere slowly, the way it always did in that country, the drifts retreating from the courtyard, stone by stone rather than all at once, the North Road reopening to ordinary traffic for the first time since the blizzard that had started all of it. Aylesworth kept her post in the still-room through the thaw, though she no longer needed to, and found she didn't want to give it up simply because she could. She found him, on one of the first true warm evenings, in the same council chamber where she had once watched him hold a page he wasn't reading. The candle was different, the stillness in him was not. "I never let you finish," she said, from the doorway. "The night of the fire, you said you didn't want me reassigned, and then the bell rang, and you never finished the rest of it." He looked up, and something in his whole posture eased, the particular ease of a man who had been waiting weeks for exactly this conversation, without knowing when it would come. "No," he agreed, "I didn't." "So finish it." He set down whatever he'd been holding, and crossed the room to her, unhurried, the whole long weight of the winter behind them, both in the space he closed. "I wanted to ask why you gave a dying animal the only warm thing you owned, on a road that could have killed you just as easily, for no reason you had any way of knowing mattered. I wanted to tell you that I have run this hold for 11 years without once needing anyone the way I needed you in that hut, and that it terrified me, and that it still does. Some days, I wanted to ask you to stay, not as staff, not reassigned to anywhere, here because I asked you to be, for as long as you'll have it. That's a great many things to say all at once. I've had a whole winter to practice saying them badly. I thought I should get them all out before the bell rings again." She laughed, unexpected and real, and it undid something in his careful composure that she watched happen in real time, his hand coming up to her face, before either of them had quite decided it should, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, with a gentleness that belonged nowhere near a man his size and his power, and yet fit him entirely. "Why did you change my roster?" she asked, quieter now. "Really, 3 weeks after the storm, before either of us had said any of this out loud. Because I couldn't stand the thought of you walking back across that yard alone in the dark, and I told myself it was an administrative correction, and I have been telling myself something like that about every single thing I've done for you since, right up until tonight. That's 6 weeks of administrative corrections." "I'm aware," he said, and kissed her. It was brief, and it was certain, his forehead resting against hers again afterward, in the same way it had the night of the fire, except this time there was no emergency, waiting to pull him away from it. No bell, no fire, nothing but the quiet of a chamber emptied of council business and the ordinary sound of spring water somewhere beyond the walls. They found her, weeks later, in the yard at dawn, the way the kennel master had once described the hounds finding her, except now it was simply a habit of the household, expected and unremarked, the Alpha King's wolves settling around the woman who had once given her only cloak to a dying stranger in a blizzard, not because an old charter said they had to, but because in whatever language wolves and their kind used to decide such things, the choice had long since stopped needing to be argued for. His pack had come to her by dawn on the worst night of that winter, one after another, until there was no version of the story left to tell in which she had not always belonged at Frostmere Hold. She stayed. He built the rest of his reign around the fact of her staying quietly, the way he did everything that mattered most to him, and on cold mornings for the rest of their lives together, when the frost came in hard off the northern ridge, she kept a second cloak by the door, just in case something out there in the snow needed it more than she did.